The wooden pew was empty except for a small yellow ribbon tied around the end of it, and when Esther Lockhart saw it, her legs nearly gave out beneath her right there in the doorway of Caldwell Creek's First Methodist Church. She had not agreed to come. She had never agreed to come. She had told the child's sweet, persistent, wide-eyed Lily Stone at least 4 separate times across 4 separate weeks that she was not a church-going woman, that she had her reasons, and that those reasons were her own business. She had said it gently the first time and more firmly the last, and yet here was that yellow ribbon, tied with a careful, childish bow, saving her a place as though her attendance were a foregone conclusion, as though someone had looked at the broken, hidden parts of Esther Lockhart and decided she belonged here anyway. What made her chest crack open entirely was not the ribbon. It was the man sitting at the far end of that same pew. Theodore Stone sat with his hat pressed between both hands and his dark eyes fixed on the pulpit, and he did not look at her. He was a broad-shouldered man with a jaw cut from granite and hands that had spent a decade working cattle and hard earth, and he was pretending with every muscle in his body that he had not seen her walk in. That pretense cost him something. She could see it in the rigid line of his back, in the way his thumb worked slow circles against the brim of his hat. Between them on the pew was the space Lily had saved. A child's simple act of faith. A trap she had walked right into. And the most terrifying, most betrayal-flavored thought that shot through Esther Lockhart's mind in that suspended second was not that she ought to leave. It was that she did not want to. She stood there frozen while the organ played something low and reverent, while the good citizens of Caldwell Creek, Texas, shuffled into their rows, and the autumn light of 1883 fell pale and golden through plain glass windows, and she understood with the clarity of a woman who had survived too many dark things that something had already changed. Something had shifted in her chest like a stone rolling away from a door she had bolted years ago, and she could not bolt it again. Not with that yellow ribbon staring back at her, not with Theodore Stone's shoulders carrying all that careful, deliberate stillness. She sat down. She did not know yet that sitting down would cost her everything she had built to keep herself safe. She did not know yet that it would give her back everything she had lost. She only knew that Lily's small, hopeful ribbon made it impossible to do anything else. It had started 6 weeks before that Sunday morning, on the kind of September afternoon that made the Texas hill country look like God was showing off, all amber grass and enormous sky, the kind of beauty that felt almost accusatory when a person was not doing well. Esther Lockhart was not doing well. She had arrived in Caldwell Creek 3 months earlier with a single trunk, $200 sewn into the hem of her dress, and a story she intended to tell no one. She had taken the position of schoolteacher because the town needed one, and because teaching was the one skill she possessed that carried no uncomfortable questions with it. Children asked questions freely and forgot the answers just as freely, and she preferred that to the pointed curiosity of adults. She had rented 2 rooms above the dry goods store from a widow named Mrs. Hatch who charged fair rent, and asked for none of Esther's history, which recommended her enormously. Caldwell Creek in 1883 was a cattle town in the middle of finding itself. The railroad had come through 2 years prior, which meant money was arriving, and with it, the ambition to become something more permanent than a collection of weathered storefronts. There were nearly 400 souls in and around the township now, a school that had been without a teacher for 7 months, a church, 2 saloons, a doctor, a sheriff of questionable energy, and the Stone Ranch, which sat 3 miles east of town on 400 acres of worked land and represented roughly a third of the county's cattle operation. Esther had heard about Theodore Stone the way a person hears about the weather. Unavoidably, he was discussed as a fact of the landscape. A widower, people said, lost his wife 4 years back, raising his daughter alone out there, keeps to himself mostly. Good man, though, honest man. She had not sought out more information than that because she was not in the habit of caring about men who kept to themselves on ranches, no matter how honestly they did it. Then Lily Stone had walked into her classroom on the first day of school, and everything had shifted slightly on its axis. Lily was 8 years old and possessed of the most extraordinary self-possession Esther had ever seen in a child. She was not the most academically eager student, though she was bright enough. What made her unusual was her certainty. She moved through the world as though she had already decided how things were going to go and was simply waiting for events to confirm it. She had her father's dark eyes, and what Esther guessed from those eyes alone was his directness. She had introduced herself on the first day by walking up to Esther's desk and saying, without preamble, "My name is Lily Stone. My papa says you are from back east somewhere. My mama came from Georgia. She died when I was 4. I do not remember her very well, but I keep her photograph beside my bed." Then she had sat down in the front row and opened her reader, clearly considering the necessary information exchanged. Esther had stood behind her desk and experienced the peculiar sensation of being simultaneously moved and completely disarmed. She had managed to say, "Thank you, Lily. I'm glad to have you in class." Lily had looked up from her reader. "I'm glad to be here, Miss Lockhart. Our last teacher left because she did not like the rattlesnakes." A pause. "Do you like rattlesnakes?" "I do not have strong feelings about rattlesnakes," Esther had said. Lily had considered this. "That's probably better than not liking them," she had decided, and gone back to her reader. The first time Theodore Stone came to the schoolhouse, it was for the mandatory parent meeting Esther held at the end of September, 2 weeks after school had begun. He came alone, arriving after most of the other parents had already left, which meant Esther had her first real look at him in an empty room with good afternoon light coming through the windows. He was taller than she had expected, and quieter. He took off his hat when he came in the door, which was not a universal habit among the men in Caldwell Creek, and he held it in front of him with both hands in a way that Esther would come to recognize as his particular mode of careful attention. "Miss Lockhart," he said. "I'm Theodore Stone, Lily's father." "I know," she said, then because that sounded abrupt, "she speaks of you." Something moved in his expression. "Good things, I hope. She tells me you are teaching her to read the cattle brands in the county register. She considers this to be more practical education than arithmetic." He almost smiled. It was a restrained thing, that almost smile, but it reached his eyes. "She may not be wrong." "She may not be," Esther agreed. "But arithmetic has its uses." They had talked for perhaps 20 minutes about Lily's progress and her tendency to help other children with their work whether they asked for help or not, and about the fact that she wrote with her left hand, which Esther had no intention of forcing her to change, a position she stated plainly, because she had learned it was better to state such positions before they became arguments. Theodore Stone had listened to this last point with that same quality of careful attention, and then said, "Good. Our last teacher tried to make her switch. It distressed her considerably." "It would distress anyone," Esther said. He had looked at her then with something that was not quite an appraisal and not quite gratitude, but lived somewhere between the two. "I appreciate that, Miss Lockhart." She had nodded and made a note in her register, and he had put on his hat and left, and she had told herself that was that. But the dark past she carried with her was not so easy to outrun, and it was beginning to catch up. Her name had not always been Esther Lockhart. Or rather, it had always been Esther, but Lockhart was her mother's maiden name, the name she had taken when she left Kansas City, and the other name behind. The name she had left behind was Esther Calloway, and attached to that name was a story she had not told anyone in Caldwell Creek, a story involving a man named Franklin Calloway, who was her husband in the eyes of the law and the church and the state of Missouri, and who had spent 4 years making that legal reality into a private hell of the particular and systematic kind that leaves no visible marks and is therefore very difficult to explain. She had left in March of 1883. She had traveled south and then west. She had the $200, which represented 2 years of careful, secret saving, and she had her teaching certificates from before the marriage, which she had kept hidden in a place Franklin never searched because he did not believe education was something worth stealing. She had not divorced him because divorce for a woman in 1883 required a degree of legal exposure she could not risk. She was not entirely certain what would happen if Franklin found her. She was entirely certain she did not want to find out. She was living, therefore, on borrowed time in a borrowed name in a borrowed life, and every Sunday when the church bell rang and the good people of Caldwell Creek walked past her window below on their way to services, she felt the weight of that secret like a hand pressed against the back of her skull. She did not go to church because she did not want to stand in front of God and her neighbors simultaneously while carrying a hidden life. It felt dishonest in a way that violated something deep in her, some bedrock thing she had not yet been able to name. The first Sunday Lily saved her a seat, Esther knew nothing about it. Mrs. Hatch mentioned it casually over supper that evening, saying that Lily Stone had been seen tying a piece of yellow ribbon to the end of the third pew back, and had apparently told anyone who asked that she was saving it for Miss Lockhart. Esther had put down her fork. Lily told her Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Hatch continued, with the cheerful relish of someone conveying excellent gossip, that Miss Lockhart simply had not come to church yet because she had not thought of it yet, and that she expected the ribbon would help Miss Lockhart think of it. Esther had looked at her plate for a long moment and then said, "I will need to have a word with Lily." She had the word with Lily the following Monday at the end of the school day, after the other children had left. She had told Lily, as kindly and as firmly as she knew how, that it was generous of her to think of it, but that church attendance was a personal decision, and that Esther did not intend to attend. Lily had listened to this with her characteristic gravity. Then she had said, "I will keep saving the seat, Miss Lockhart, in case you change your mind." "Lily, my papa says it is always better to have a seat saved than to need one and not have one," Lily said, with the serenity of someone quoting scripture. Esther had looked at her for a long moment. "Your papa is talking about cattle and water rights." Lily had blinked. "He says it applies broadly. Tell your papa." Esther had stopped herself, because the thought that had arrived was both inappropriate and startling, and also because she had not given Theodore Stone permission to live in her thoughts and she was not about to start now. "Tell my papa what, Miss Lockhart?" Lily asked. "That you are a credit to him," Esther said, which was true and also completely beside the point. The following Sunday, the ribbon was back on the third pew. Esther knew because two separate people told her about it before noon. The Sunday after that, she heard about it without asking at all, simply because it had become, apparently, a conversation point in Caldwell Creek. She heard Lily Stone is at it again with that yellow ribbon, while she was buying flour at the dry goods store, and she felt something that was equal parts exasperated and devastatingly tender. It was around this time that Theodore Stone began appearing in her vicinity in ways that were clearly accidental and just as clearly not. He came by the schoolhouse on a Wednesday afternoon, ostensibly to drop off a geography book that Lily had borrowed and forgotten, though Lily had been carrying the book in her bag all week and Esther had seen it there. He had stood in the doorway of the schoolroom while Esther graded papers, turning his hat in his hands in that way he had, and they had talked for 35 minutes about geography and cattle trail routes and the politics of the new county seat, and it was the most naturally Esther had talked to another person in nearly a year. She had not missed talking to people. She had not known she missed talking to people. It was alarming to discover it now. He came by on a Friday to ask if the school needed any repairs, which was a reasonable question on its face, and which led to a conversation about the schoolhouse roof and the creek that flooded in spring, and the fact that Esther had requisitioned a second bookshelf from the county board 3 months ago with no response. Theodore had looked at the wall where the second bookshelf was needed, and he had come back the following Tuesday with 2 men from his ranch and a well-made oak bookshelf that he had apparently built himself in the evenings. Esther had stood in the doorway and watched it being installed, and felt something deeply alarming happening in her chest. "Mr. Stone," she had said, "I cannot accept this." "It's for the school," he said, "not for you. The school cannot accept it without my approval as the teacher. He had looked at her with those dark, direct eyes. Then I'm asking your approval. She had been quiet for a moment. You built this yourself. I had time in the evenings. He said it with a careful neutrality that somehow conveyed the opposite of casual. A man who builds bookshelves in his evenings after a full day's work on a cattle ranch is not filling idle time. He is filling something else. She had understood that, and the understanding had frightened her. "Thank you," she had said, and meant it in a way that went several layers deeper than she wanted it to. He had nodded and picked up his hat and left, and Esther had sat down at her desk and pressed her hands flat on the surface of it and given herself a very firm, very serious internal conversation about the nature of her circumstances and the absolute necessity of not allowing any part of those circumstances to involve Theodore Stone. She was a woman with a dark past and a hidden identity, and a husband who was alive somewhere in Missouri, and who had every legal right to come and take her back. Theodore Stone was a good man who was raising his daughter alone and building bookshelves in the evenings, and he deserved considerably better than to be entangled with a woman carrying secrets that could unravel everything. She had told herself this clearly and believed it completely. The next Sunday, she looked out her window and watched the families of Caldwell Creek walking to church, and she thought about the yellow ribbon on the third pew, and she poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down with a book and held the line. The thing she had not accounted for was Lily, who held lines of her own. It was the fourth Sunday of October when Lily came to find Esther. Not in school, not in some incidental crossing of paths, but deliberately on a Sunday afternoon, appearing at Mrs. Hatch's front door and asking if she might speak with Miss Lockhart. Mrs. Hatch, who found Lily Stone enormously charming, had sent for Esther with undisguised delight. Esther had come downstairs to find Lily standing on the front porch in her Sunday dress, which was blue calico with white trim, and her Sunday shoes, which were clearly uncomfortable, and her hair in 2 braids tied with yellow ribbon. "Hello, Lily," Esther said. "Hello, Miss Lockhart," Lily said. "I have come to ask you a direct question, if that is all right." Esther sat down on the porch step so that they were closer to eye level. "All right. Why do you not come to church?" Lily asked. "And before you tell me it is personal, I would like to say that I already know it is personal. I am asking because I want to understand, not because I intend to argue with you." Esther looked at her for a long moment. 8 years old and already possessed of more diplomatic skill than most adults she had met. "That is a more sophisticated request than I expected, Lily. My papa says if you are going to ask a difficult question, you should be clear about why you are asking it," Lily said. "Otherwise people think you are being nosy. Are you being nosy?" Lily considered this seriously. "A little," she admitted, "but I am also genuinely concerned. My Sunday school teacher, Mrs. Abernathy, says that a woman who lives alone should have a community around her. She said it without looking at me, but I think she meant it for me to carry home." Esther felt a complicated internal motion, something between amusement and a much more serious feeling. "Mrs. Abernathy is not wrong," she said carefully. "But community can take many forms, Lily. I have community, I have my students, I have Mrs. Hatch." "Mrs. Hatch is 71, Lily said. "She goes to bed at 8 o'clock. She goes to bed at 8:30. Lily was unimpressed by this distinction. "Miss Lockhart," she said, with a gravity that was almost comical in its weight and almost heartbreaking in its sincerity, "I save your seat every Sunday because I think you should have somewhere to be. I think you are lonely, even though you do not say so, and I think the loneliness is the kind that does not get better by itself. And I think," she stopped and looked down at her Sunday shoes for a moment, "I think my papa feels the same way, and that is why he sits at the other end of the seat." The silence that followed was the loudest silence Esther had experienced in years. She said, finally, "Lily, your father and I are acquaintances." "My papa talks about you at supper," Lily said. "Teachers are common supper conversation. He asked me last week what your favorite book was." Esther was quiet. And the week before that he fixed the fence on the side of the road nearest to town, and I heard him tell one of the ranch hands that the fence post was loose and might fall on the road where the schoolteacher walks, which is true, but he has known about that fence post since July, Lily said. Esther pressed her fingers to her mouth for a moment. Not to suppress a smile exactly, though something adjacent to a smile was happening, more to hold in place something that felt very large and very precarious. Lily, she said, Miss Lockhart, you are 8 years old. I am nearly 9, Lily said, and I am also correct. Being nearly 9 does not make a person correct. Being correct makes a person correct, Lily said. I am correct separately from being nearly 9. Esther stood up from the porch step and looked at this extraordinary child in her blue calico dress and her uncomfortable Sunday shoes and her yellow ribbon braids, and she felt the locked door in her chest strain against its bolt in a way that was becoming very difficult to ignore. I will think about Sunday, she said. Lily nodded, as though this were exactly what she had expected. The ribbon will be there, she said, and walked down the porch steps with the careful dignity of someone in uncomfortable shoes, and turned toward the road that led 3 miles out to the Stone Ranch. Esther watched her go and then sat back down on the porch step and stayed there for a very long time. She could not go to church. She could not stand in front of people and sing hymns and shake hands and be welcomed into community while carrying what she carried. It felt like fraud. It felt like wearing a borrowed dress to a ball and hoping no one noticed. But she also understood, sitting on that porch in the October afternoon with the cottonwood trees turning gold along the creek bank, that she could not continue to do nothing. The trapped life she had escaped from was doing something to her that was almost as damaging as the life itself. The hiding, the silence, the careful construction of a person who let nothing in and nothing out. It was its own kind of prison. A quieter one but no less real. She needed, she realized, to make a choice. Not about church. Not about Theodore Stone, which was still several layers of impossible that she was not ready to examine. But about whether she intended to survive her past only to become her own jailer. The choice arrived faster than she had planned, because the past arrived the following week. His name was Remy Good, and he had worked for Franklin Calloway in Kansas City, doing the kind of work that careful, wealthy men hire other men to do when they do not want to be seen doing it themselves. He rode into Caldwell Creek on a Tuesday morning and had a conversation with the sheriff, and by Tuesday afternoon, Esther knew about it because Mrs. Hatch's nephew was the sheriff's deputy, and Mrs. Hatch had very good ears. A man came to town asking about a woman traveling alone, Mrs. Hatch said in a voice carefully pitched low. Said she was owed money by her family and needed to be found. Described a woman about your age, your coloring, who might be using a different name. Esther had set down the dish she was drying, slowly, carefully. I told my nephew that I had no knowledge of any such woman, Mrs. Hatch said, and that the man had an untrustworthy look about him, which in my experience means an untrustworthy character. My nephew does not require much persuading. But I imagine the man will ask around town. Esther had stood very still for a long moment, the dish towel in her hands, and then she had said, Mrs. Hatch, I owe you the truth, she had told her. Not everything, she could not yet say all of it, but enough. Enough that Mrs. Hatch understood the shape of what Esther had run from, and enough that the older woman's expression shifted from careful concern to something harder and more decided. You will stay here, Mrs. Hatch said, and we will say nothing. I cannot put you at risk, Esther, Mrs. Hatch said, and it was the first time she had used her given name, which meant something. I have lived in this county for 40 years, and I have seen what happens to women who have no one to stand with them. You will stay here and we will say nothing, and the man will find nothing and go. Remy Good stayed in town for 3 days. He asked questions in the saloons and at the general store and at the livery. He was good at his work, which meant he was careful and patient and did not look threatening when he was being threatening. On the second day, he came to the school. Esther heard his boots on the schoolhouse steps and knew who it was before she saw him. There were only 12 children in the schoolroom, including Lily Stone, who was in the front row. Esther had a breath and a half to decide what to do. She put her most ordinary expression on and continued the arithmetic lesson. Good opened the door and looked in. He was a lean man with a pleasant face that sat over a cold interior, the way a decorative front on a plain building can fool you if you do not look closely. He looked at her. She looked back. She allowed her eyes to carry no recognition, no alarm, nothing but the mild professional attention of a teacher interrupted during a lesson. "Can I help you?" she said. "Beg pardon, ma'am, looking for the schoolteacher." "You have found her, Esther Lockhart." She said her name deliberately, clearly, the way a woman who has always been Esther Lockhart would say it. "I am in the middle of a lesson, as you can see. If you need to speak with me about enrollment, I am available after 3 o'clock." He looked at her for a moment too long. She held his gaze with the absolute stillness of someone who had learned to hold very still under pressure and looked down at the book in her hands and back up with a faintly expectant air. He could not find what he was looking for in her face because she had not put it there. "My apologies, ma'am," he said, and left. She resumed the arithmetic lesson. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not, so she kept them behind her back. After school, she looked out the window and saw Lily standing in the schoolyard talking to the man. She experienced a bolt of fear so sharp and sudden it was almost physical. She walked to the door and opened it and said, "Lily, would you come inside for a moment?" Lily looked up at her. Then she looked at Good. Then she looked back at Esther, and something in the child's face, that extraordinary precocious intelligence, understood that this was not ordinary. She excused herself from the conversation with the grave politeness of someone who has been taught manners and walked into the schoolhouse. Esther shut the door. "What did he ask you?" Esther said. "He asked if I knew any women new to town who did not have family nearby," Lily said. "He said he was trying to help a family find someone." She paused. "He did not seem like someone who helps families." "No," Esther agreed. "He does not." She looked at this 8-year-old child and made a decision she had not planned to make. "Lily, I need you to do something for me. I need you to tell your father, only your father, that I need to speak with him tonight, not at the school, at Mrs. Hatch's." Lily looked at her steadily. "All right," she said. "Should I tell him it is urgent?" "Yes." "I will ride back now," Lily said, reaching for her coat from the hook by the door. Lily, the child, looked up at her, her dark eyes very calm and very serious. "Thank you," Esther said. Theodore Stone arrived at Mrs. Hatch's house at 7 o'clock that evening, which meant he had ridden 3 miles in the near dark, which meant Lily had delivered the message with appropriate urgency, and he had not wasted time. He came to the front door rather than the side door, which Mrs. Hatch said was the mark of a man who intended to be seen doing something respectable, and Mrs. Hatch let him in and put coffee on and retired upstairs with a tact that Esther had not known she possessed. Theodore sat across from her at the kitchen table and she told him everything, not just the Good piece of it, all of it. The marriage in 1879, when she had been 23 and Franklin Calloway, had seemed like stability and turned out to be a different thing entirely. The 4 years of a life that diminished her slowly and systematically, like water on stone, not through dramatic cruelty but through 1,000 small constrictions of what she was allowed to do, to say, to think, to be. The saving of money, the planning, the leaving, the false name, the teaching certificates, the slow reconstruction of herself in a new place. She told him because he deserved to know it if he was going to help her, and she could see already that he was going to try to help her, and it felt dishonest to accept help from a man who did not know what he was helping with. She told him also because Lily's words on the porch had lodged in her like a splinter, and she could not get them out. The loneliness is the kind that does not get better by itself. She had been carrying this story alone for 8 months, and carrying it alone was something that had once felt like protection and now felt like a stone tied around her neck. Theodore listened to all of it without interrupting. This was, she would later think, one of the most remarkable things about him. Not that he listened. Many people could listen when the subject was interesting. But he listened in a way that did not require her to manage his reaction while she spoke. He did not look horrified or pitying or judgmental, which were the three reactions she had feared most. He looked attentive and serious, and when she finished, he was quiet for a moment that was long enough to mean he was thinking rather than short enough to mean he had already decided. "This man who is in town," he said, "he has no authority to compel you to go anywhere." "My husband may have gotten a court order." "Even so," Theodore said. "A court order from Missouri has no standing here until it's processed through the Texas courts. That takes time, and there is a question of whether the original marriage was entered into freely." He said the last sentence carefully without making it into something she had to flinch from. Esther looked at him. "You know something about the law." "My father was a lawyer. I read his books as a boy." He paused. "And I have a friend in Galveston who practices. I can write to him." "Mr. Stone, Theodore," he said, "I think we are past Mr. Stone." She looked down at her coffee cup and then back up at him. There was something happening in the room that she did not have a name for yet, something that had the quality of a door opening in a dark hallway and light coming through from the other side. "Theodore," she said. It cost her something to say it in the best possible way. "Esther," he said, and there was nothing in his voice except her name, quiet and steady, but it hit her with the force of something much larger because it was the first time someone had said her name, her actual name, the one she had chosen for herself in a way that sounded like it belonged to her. "What do I do about my good?" she asked. "Nothing," he said. "You go about your work. You are Esther Lockhart, schoolteacher, who has lived here all year. You do not run, because running confirms the story. I will speak with the sheriff tomorrow and make certain there is no legal basis for any action." The sheriff barely does anything, I am aware," Theodore said, and a dryness came into his voice that made her want to smile despite everything. "Which means he will also barely do anything about a man from Missouri asking questions, as long as someone makes clear it is not worth his trouble." She exhaled. Some of the held tension in her shoulders released, and she was aware of it releasing in a way that made her realize how long she had been holding it. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. The question sat in the air between them. He looked at her, and there was something in his expression that was very careful and very honest at the same time, the expression of a man who is about to say something true and knows it. "Because you are alone," he said, "and because you should not have to be." Ramai Good left Caldwell Creek on Thursday morning. Whether it was the sheriff's pointed lack of cooperation or the simple absence of anything useful to find, he left without making any direct move toward Esther, and she watched him ride out from the window of the schoolhouse with her hands flat on her desk and her heart doing something complicated and enormous. The immediate threat had passed. The underlying problem remained. She was still technically, legally, Franklin Calloway's wife. She was still living under a name that was not entirely hers. She was still, by any reasonable assessment, a woman whose circumstances made any further complication in her personal life unwise at minimum and potentially catastrophic at worst. She told herself this firmly for 3 days. Then Sunday came. She was dressed before she had consciously decided to get dressed. Her best dress, which was deep green wool, and her good boots, and her hair pinned more carefully than usual. She had told herself she was going to take a walk, and the walk was not necessarily to church, and she was simply going to see how she felt as she went. She had felt as she went that her feet were walking toward the church, and when she arrived at the door and looked through it and saw the wooden pew with the yellow ribbon tied at the end of it, and Theodore Stone at the far end with his hat in his hands and his careful stillness, she had stood in the doorway and felt the whole weight of the previous 6 weeks press against the back of her eyes. She sat down. The space between them on the pew was approximately 3 feet of polished wood, and it contained, as far as Esther was concerned, enough significance to fill a room. Lily was in the children's section at the front, but she turned almost immediately, with the unerring spatial awareness of a child who has been tracking this situation closely, and her face when she saw Esther sitting in the saved seat was something that Esther knew she would carry with her for the rest of her life. Joy without calculation, Complete, uncomplicated gladness. Lily waved. A small, excited wave, quickly suppressed into Sunday decorum. Esther nodded back, and the back of her throat ached. The service was ordinary and familiar, and she had not been to church in 4 years, and the hymns were the ones she had grown up with. She did not sing at first, and then, on the third hymn, which was one she had known since she was 6 years old, she found her voice coming in low and then steadier. It was not a performance. It was something more private than that. Theodore did not look at her during the service. He looked at the pulpit and at his hymnal and at his hands, and that deliberate respect for her privacy in a public space was, somehow, the thing that finally cracked the fortress she had been building for 4 years. After the service in the churchyard, Lily abandoned Sunday decorum entirely and wound her arms around Esther's waist and said, "You came," in a voice that was simply and completely full. "I came," Esther said, and held her for a moment. Theodore stood nearby, and when Lily released her, he looked at Esther with an expression that said many things he was not going to say in the churchyard, and held out his hand, and she took it, and they shook hands in the perfectly respectable way of a rancher and a schoolteacher, except that neither of them let go immediately, and a woman named Agnes Darby, who was standing 12 feet away, saw it, and would later describe it as the most charged handshake she had ever witnessed. The letter Theodore had written to his friend in Galveston came back 3 weeks later with information that changed everything. There was, it turned out, a legal doctrine applicable to Esther's situation that his friend believed could be argued successfully in a Texas court. The marriage in Missouri had been entered into without full disclosure of Franklin Calloway's circumstances. There were debts hidden at the time and a prior legal matter that had been concealed, and there was a case to be made for annulment on grounds of fraud. In Texas, under Texas law, which was what mattered, it would not be immediate, it would not be simple. But it was possible. It was a door where Esther had believed there was only a wall. Theodore brought the letter to her at the school on a Monday afternoon, waiting until the children had gone, and put it on her desk without preamble and stood back while she read it. She read it twice and then a third time slowly, and then she set it down. "This is real," she said. "It is real." She put both hands flat on the desk the way she did when she needed to feel something solid under her palms. "It will cost money and time. The money is manageable," he said. "I have resources." She looked up at him sharply. "Theodore, before you say no," he said, "let me say 2 things." She waited. "First, it is a loan, if that makes it easier, and we can discuss terms and I will put them in writing if you want. And second," he paused, and in that pause she could see him choosing words with the same care he gave to everything, that deliberate, unhurried precision that was one of the things she had come to understand as the most fundamental quality of him. "Second, I have a reason that is not entirely practical for wanting your circumstances to be resolved." The room was very quiet. "Theodore," she said. "I know," he said. "I know it is too soon. I know there is a great deal that needs to happen before any conversation of that kind is reasonable. I am not asking for anything, and I am not saying anything that requires an answer tonight or in the near future. I am only saying it so that you know, so that you are not wondering." She looked at him across her desk in the empty schoolroom, in the November afternoon light, and she thought about all the reasons this was complicated, and all the reasons she had been telling herself it was impossible. And she thought also about Lily's voice, saying the loneliness is the kind that does not get better by itself. And she thought about 4 years of careful diminishment and 8 months of careful isolation, and whether the rest of her life was going to be defined by what Franklin Calloway had taken from her or by what she chose to build instead. "I am not wondering," she said. He looked at her. "I know," she said. "I have known for some time." He reached across the desk and covered her hand with his, and they stayed that way for a moment in the empty schoolroom, and it was the simplest thing and the most significant thing, and she was aware of both of those being true at once. "I am going to write to my friend in Galveston tomorrow," he said, "and we are going to sort this out. And then," she agreed. The legal process took most of the winter. There were documents to be gathered and filed and argued, and Theodore's friend in Galveston, a sharp and principled man named Edmund Voss, came to Caldwell Creek in December to meet with Esther in person and take her account of the marriage and its fraudulent foundations. She told him what she had told Theodore, and more besides, and Edmund Voss listened with the focused attention of a man building a case and asked questions that were precise and sometimes difficult. And when they were done, he told her that the case was strong. Franklin Calloway, when notified by the court, sent a lawyer of his own, which meant he intended to contest it, which was frightening in the way that any confirmation of a feared thing is frightening. But Edmund Voss had been practicing law for 20 years, and he was not intimidated by a Missouri lawyer. And Esther had Theodore, who was steady in the way that bedrock is steady, immovable not because it is rigid, but because it is fundamental. He came to Mrs. Hatch's twice a week through December and January, always in the early evening, always with some practical purpose, bringing firewood when the wood box was low, bringing a game for Lily, who had taken to spending Friday afternoons with Esther in a way that had evolved naturally and happily into a kind of standing arrangement. Sometimes he stayed for supper. Sometimes they sat in Mrs. Hatch's parlor while the fire burned low and the wind worked against the windows outside, and talked about things that had nothing to do with legal proceedings or dark pasts, talked about books and the state of the county and what kind of spring planting Theodore was planning, and whether Esther had been to the hill country before she came to Caldwell Creek. She had not been anywhere much, she told him, before she came to Caldwell Creek. Then this will be the place you start from, he said. She had looked at the fire and thought that this was possibly the most quietly revolutionary thing anyone had ever said to her. Lily, for her part, had settled into a state of satisfied equilibrium about the whole situation. She did not appear surprised by any development. She answered questions about Theodore and Esther from her schoolmates with a serenity that suggested she had always known how things would go and was only waiting for the adults to work it out. She continued to save Esther's seat every Sunday, even after Esther had been attending church for 8 consecutive weeks, and there was no longer any question about her attendance, because she said the ribbon was familiar now, and the pew looked wrong without it. The annulment was granted in February 1884 by a Texas court, on grounds of fraud in the original marriage contract. Edmund Voss sent word by telegram, and the telegram arrived on a Thursday morning, and Esther was in the middle of teaching a reading lesson when the telegraph boy came to the schoolhouse door. She read the telegram and then she set it down on her desk and said, very calmly, "Children, please continue reading chapter 7. I need a moment." She walked to the window and looked out at the February sky, which was pale and cold and infinite, and she put one hand on the glass and felt the cold coming through it, and she breathed. She was Esther Lockhart, only Esther Lockhart. Not anyone's property, not anyone's possession, not the defined and limited thing that 4 years had tried to make her. She was a woman standing in a schoolroom in Texas with her hand on cold glass and a telegram on her desk, and the rest of her life spread out in front of her like unbroken ground. She spent the school day as usual. She did not send for Theodore because this news was hers to sit with first, hers to feel in full, and she needed a few hours before she shared it. She went to Mrs. Hatch's and ate supper, and sat in her room upstairs and read the telegram again, and then she wrote Theodore a note and gave it to the stable boy to carry out to the ranch. He arrived the next morning before school, which meant he had read the note at night and come at first light, and when she came downstairs, he was at the front door with his hat in his hands and the particular stillness of a man who is feeling something very large and holding it with great care. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he said. She had thought she might cry, but she did not. What she felt was larger and quieter than crying. It was the feeling of standing in a room that has been locked for a long time and finally opening the windows. He reached out and took her hand, and she let him, and they stood in Mrs. Hatch's doorway in the February morning, and it was everything and it was enough. The courtship that followed was not hurried. Theodore was constitutionally incapable of hurrying something that mattered, and Esther had learned to distrust speed in all things that counted, so they proceeded at a pace that was careful and genuine, and allowed everything to be what it actually was rather than what it might appear. He took her driving on Sunday afternoons in his wagon, with Lily in the back making pointed commentary on the scenery. He brought her books from the county seat, and she lent him books from the school library, and they argued constructively about history, and agreed about almost everything regarding the present state of the cattle industry in Texas, which he found endlessly amusing, because he had not expected to find a woman who had opinions about the cattle industry in Texas. She had explained that she had opinions about most things, and he had said, "I know, that is one of the things I most admire about you." In the direct, undramatic way he said significant things, and she had been quiet for a moment because admiration, freely and straightforwardly given, was still something she was learning to receive. Spring came to Caldwell Creek in March, and with it the wildflowers, which turned the hill country into something that made even people who had lived there all their lives stop and acknowledge that they were looking at something extraordinary. Bluebonnets along every road and ridge, sheets of Indian paintbrush, the creek running full and quick with snowmelt from the Edwards Plateau to the northwest. Theodore took her riding one Saturday in March, which required that she admit she had not ridden a horse in 3 years, which he received without any particular reaction, except to spend an unhurried hour in the paddock with her relearning the basics before they set out on a gentle route through the eastern pastures of the Stone Ranch. She had forgotten, in 3 years of city and then careful hiding, that she had once loved to ride. The memory came back through her hands and her body before it came back through her mind, and by the end of the afternoon she was something she had not been in a very long time. Glad, plainly and simply glad. Theodore rode beside her and pointed out the landmarks of his land with the quiet pride of a man who has worked something into existence with his own hands, and she listened and asked questions, and when they stopped on a low ridge to look back at the ranch buildings in the afternoon light, he said, "I want to ask you something." She looked at him. "I want to ask it properly," he said. "I want to take whatever time you need for the answer. There is no pressure and no urgency, and if the answer is not yet, then not yet is a complete and acceptable answer." "Theodore," she said. "I love you," he said first. He said it the way he said everything that mattered, which was simply and directly and with full weight. "I want you to know that before the question, because the question is separate from the love. The love does not depend on the answer." She felt the March wind on her face and the solidness of the horse beneath her and the absolute clarity of a moment she would remember for the rest of her life. "Ask the question," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. The Texas hill country was very bright and very beautiful around them, and she had come from a dark place to get here, and she was not yet everything she intended to become, but she was Esther Lockhart, whole and free, and standing in the open with a man who said "I love you" before the question because the question was separate from the love. "Yes," she said. He looked at her with something in his face that was not surprise. He had hoped, she thought. He had truly hoped, but was something richer than hope. Relief, maybe. Gratitude of the specific and profound kind that comes when something you feared you did not deserve turns out to be real after all. He reached across the space between the horses and took her hand and held it, and they sat on the ridge in the March light and the wind moved through the grass below them, and it was the beginning of everything that came after. Lily's response to the news was immediate and characteristic. She said, "Good," with absolute serenity, as though a long-anticipated correct answer had finally been confirmed. Then she said, "May I be in the wedding?" And then, after a pause, "Also may I keep calling you Miss Lockhart for a little while longer? It will seem strange to call you something else all at once." Esther had held her face in both hands and said, "You may call me whatever you like for as long as you like." "Eventually I will probably call you Mama," Lily said, in the tone of someone making a practical forecast. If that is all right. Esther's throat had closed entirely for a moment. She had managed. That is very all right. Good, Lily said again and went back to her reading. They married in May, on a Saturday, in the First Methodist Church of Caldwell Creek, which was the same church where Esther had stood frozen in the doorway 8 months earlier looking at a yellow ribbon on a pew. The church was full because Caldwell Creek had watched this particular story develop with a great deal of invested interest and was not going to miss the conclusion. Esther wore ivory, not white, because she was a practical woman who did not intend to wear a white dress in Texas in May, and she carried a bouquet of wildflowers that Lily had collected from the ranch meadow the day before with intense seriousness of purpose. Lily herself wore the same blue calico Sunday dress with the white trim, and she was allowed to sit in the front row during the ceremony because she had technically started this whole thing, and everyone present, including the minister, seemed to feel that this deserved acknowledgement. Theodore stood at the front of the church in his good coat and his good boots, and looked at Esther when she came through the door the way a man looks at something he knows is the most important thing that has ever happened to him, and wants to make sure he is fully present for it. She walked to him and stood beside him, and they said the words that mattered, and when the minister said, "Until death do you part," she felt it land in her the way truth lands, not with drama but with the weight of something real. Theodore kissed her in the church, which was not universally done in Caldwell Creek in 1884, but nobody objected, and when they turned to face the congregation, Lily Stone was standing on the pew in the front row clapping her hands, which also nobody objected to. They moved Esther into the ranch at the end of May. She had surrendered her rooms at Mrs. Hatch's with a mixture of sadness and joy that surprised her in its complexity. Mrs. Hatch had been her first safe harbor in a long time, and saying goodbye to the place felt significant even as the place she was going to felt more significant still. Mrs. Hatch had embraced her at the door and said, "Come and have supper with me on Thursdays, you and the child if you like." "I will," Esther said, "every Thursday." She kept that promise for the next 3 years, until Mrs. Hatch passed quietly in her sleep in 1887, which was a grief that Esther felt truly and fully, the kind of grief that is also gratitude for having had the thing at all. The Stone Ranch in summer was a different world from anything Esther had lived in before. It was loud and physical and constantly in motion, and she had to learn the rhythms of it gradually, which she did with the same methodical attention she gave to anything she intended to understand. She learned which of the ranch hands were reliable and which needed managing. She learned the cattle operation from Theodore, who explained it without condescension and answered every question she asked, of which there were many. She learned that the cook, a Tejano man named Mateo who had worked for the Stone family for 12 years, would become one of her most important allies in the running of the household, and that his tortillas were the finest thing she had eaten in her life. She continued to teach school. This had required a conversation with the county school board, which in 1884 was not universally supportive of married women in teaching positions. But she had prepared for that conversation carefully, and Theodore had accompanied her not to speak on her behalf, but to make clear by his presence that she had support, which was different and which she had appreciated. The board had agreed to continue her contract, somewhat grudgingly, and she had thanked them with professional courtesy and continued to be the best teacher in the county, which was the argument that could not be countered. She and Theodore had settled into a life together that she had not known was possible, which was the most astonishing thing about it. Not that it was perfect. No life was perfect, and she was too honest with herself to want perfection, which was a word that had been used against her too many times, but that it was good in the specific, daily, real way that means you wake up in the morning, and the day is something to go into rather than something to get through. He was not demonstrative by nature, at least not in public, but in private he was a man who held her hand and asked her questions about her day, and listened to the answers and laughed at her observations, which were frequently sharp, And she was a woman who was learning slowly and with some difficulty, and with Theodore's patient help, to accept care without suspecting it. There were difficult moments. There were nights when the old darkness came back, the old reflexes of smallness and caution, and the conviction that taking up space was an imposition. Theodore had learned to recognize those nights, and he did not push through them or try to fix them quickly. He simply stayed, which was what she needed, and in the morning things were usually better, and when they were not, he stayed through the next night too. They had a son in the spring of 1886. They named him William, after Theodore's father, and he arrived at 3 in the morning after a labor that Esther would later describe as long, educational, and something she preferred not to repeat immediately. And when the doctor placed him in Theodore's arms in the gray early morning, and Theodore looked at his son for the first time, Esther watched his face do something that she had never seen it do before, which was come completely undone with love. And she thought that she would love Theodore Stone until she died just for the way he looked at his children. Lily received William with the same grave authority she brought to everything. She was 11 by then, and she held him with the careful competence of a child who had apparently decided she was going to be a responsible older sister regardless of whether anyone asked her to be, and she told him in a serious whisper that she was glad he had come and that she would teach him everything important. "He is 3 days old," Theodore said from across the room. "Then I will start slowly," Lily said. The years that followed were full years. The ranch expanded. Theodore brought in a partner for the South pasture operations, and the cattle business grew in the way that patient, well-managed things grow, steadily and without drama. Esther taught school for 4 more years, and then, when William was old enough to need her at home, and a younger teacher arrived in the county with excellent credentials and genuine enthusiasm, she transitioned out of teaching with a satisfaction she had not expected to feel, the satisfaction of handing something on that was better than you found it. She was not idle in retirement from teaching. She was incapable of idle. She had taken over the bookkeeping for the ranch, which Theodore had been doing himself with adequate but not optimal results, and had discovered within 6 months that there were 3 contracts that had been running at a small but consistent loss, and renegotiated all 3 to the considerable improvement of the Stone Ranch's annual accounts. Theodore had looked at the numbers she laid before him and said, "How did I not see this?" She had said, "Because you were looking at cattle, which is the correct priority." He had shaken his head and said she was the most useful person he had ever met, which she considered one of the better compliments she had received, because it was specific and practical, and Theodore did not say things he did not mean. She also wrote. Not for publication, not at first. She had always written privately, a habit she had maintained even through the worst of the marriage, small notebooks of observation and feeling that she kept for herself. At Lily's urging, Lily was 16 and had read widely and was unimpressed by the fiction available to young women of her era. Esther began expanding some of her writing into longer pieces, essays at first and then something adjacent to stories, and she sent one, on a dare from Theodore that she did not acknowledge was a dare, to a Houston newspaper. They published it, paid her $3, and asked for more. She wrote 4 more. They published all 4. She wrote them at the kitchen table in the evenings after William was in bed and Lily was doing her schoolwork at the other end of the table, and Theodore sat in the chair by the window reading, and this was, she thought, one of the perfect pictures of her life, not perfect in the sense of without difficulty, but perfect in the sense of exactly what it was supposed to be. Franklin Calloway died in 1888. She learned of it through Edmund Voss, who had maintained contact as a professional courtesy and who wrote to tell her that the matter was now closed in every possible sense. She sat with that letter for a long afternoon and felt many things, none of which were simple. She did not feel grief exactly, because grief requires a loss and she had not lost something she had wanted to keep, but she felt the weight of it, the whole long story of that period of her life, and she gave it its due in her thoughts before she set it down. She told Theodore that evening. He listened, and when she was done, he said, "Are you all right?" "Yes," she said. "I think I genuinely am." He put his arm around her and she leaned against his shoulder, and they sat by the window in the May evening, and she thought about the woman she had been when she left Kansas City, frightened, alone, holding $200 in her hem and a false name in her mouth, and the woman she was now, and the distance between those two women was not a straight line, but it was a complete one. "Theodore," she said. Lily started all of this, you know." He was quiet for a moment. "I know," he said. "She told me she was going to." Esther turned to look at him. "She told you." He had the expression of a man who has been found out and is not entirely displeased about it. "She came to me the first week of school and told me that Miss Lockhart was lonely and that she was going to fix it," he said. "I told her that she could not simply fix people, and she told me that she was not fixing you. She was making sure you had somewhere to be, which was different." Esther stared at him. "She was 8 years old." "She was 8 years old," he confirmed. "She also told me that I should find reasons to visit the schoolhouse, because she had noticed that I became more cheerful after the parent meeting, and she thought the causes were worth investigating." Esther sat up. "Theodore Stone, did your 8-year-old daughter orchestrate our entire courtship?" "She preferred to say she created the conditions for it," he said, with the gravity of someone relaying an important distinction. "She was very clear on that." Esther looked at him, and then she started to laugh, real laughter, the kind that starts in the chest and takes over, and Theodore watched her with enormous pleasure. And after a moment he started laughing too, and they sat by the window in the May evening laughing at the fact that they had been gently and thoroughly managed by a child with yellow ribbon and an 8-year-old's absolute certainty about how things ought to be. "I owe her everything," Esther said, when the laughter had settled. "So do I," Theodore said. Lily Stone, at the time of this conversation, was 14 years old and was sitting at the kitchen table ostensibly doing arithmetic homework, and was, in fact, reading a novel that she had hidden inside the arithmetic book, and she heard them laughing from the parlor and allowed herself a small, private smile before going back to her novel. She had known all along. In 1889, when Lily was 15, an opportunity arose that required a family decision. Theodore had been offered a partnership in a land development venture by a man named Harris out of San Antonio. Good land, good terms, and a potential for significant expansion of the ranch's holdings over the next decade. He brought it to the kitchen table, laid out the documents, and presented it to Esther and Lily together, because that was how things were decided in the Stone household. Not because Theodore lacked confidence in his own judgment, but because he had married a woman with a sharper financial mind than his own, and raised a daughter with opinions that were worth having, and ignoring either of those facts would be foolish. Esther read the documents twice and asked 7 questions. Lily asked 2 more. They spent the evening working through it, and at the end, Esther said that the terms were sound but that 2 clauses needed renegotiating, and she thought Harris would agree because he wanted the partnership more than Theodore did, which was an advantage Theodore should use. Theodore had written back to Harris the next morning, and Harris had agreed to the revised terms by return mail. "How did you know he would agree?" Theodore asked her. "Because he wrote the original letter in a hurry and made 3 arithmetic errors in the financial projections," Esther said. "A man who is that eager makes mistakes. He needed you to say yes, so we could ask for more." Theodore had looked at her for a moment with that expression she loved, the one that was admiration and amusement and something deeper all at once. "When I hired a schoolteacher," he said, "I did not anticipate also acquiring a financial strategist." "You acquired a whole person," she said. "You should not have been surprised by the range." He had kissed her then, with the thoroughness of a man who means it, and the partnership with Harris had ultimately yielded, over the following decade, an additional 600 acres and a grazing arrangement that put the Stone Ranch among the better established operations in the county. Their second child came in 1890, a daughter this time. They named her Clara, and she arrived with a full head of dark hair and immediately a strong opinion about the temperature of the room, which she expressed clearly and at volume. Lily was 16 by then, and received Clara with the same grave authority she had brought to William, except now she was old enough to actually help, which she did with genuine competence. And Clara, from her earliest conscious weeks, watched her older sister with the focused attention of someone taking notes. William at 4 was initially uncertain about the new situation, but came around quickly when he realized that Clara's arrival had somewhat relieved the focused intensity of Lily's attention from him, which he found restful. Theodore watched his family across the kitchen table on ordinary evenings, Lily reading, William drawing something elaborate on a slate board, Clara in Esther's arms, or on a blanket on the floor attempting the complex project of learning to exist, and felt the particular happiness of a man who knows that he is exactly where he is supposed to be. Not a passive happiness, not contentment that comes from having given up wanting things. An active, earned happiness that knows the price of itself and considers the price entirely worth paying. He had been a man alone for a long time after Margaret died. Not unhappy, exactly. He had Lily, and the ranch, and the steady rhythms of work, but incomplete in a way he had not fully acknowledged until the day Esther Lockhart had walked through the schoolhouse door and started teaching his daughter, and quietly, without meaning to, started teaching him things too. About what a life could look like when it was shared with someone who was genuinely herself, all the way down. Esther, for her part, had continued writing. The Houston newspaper had given way to a larger publication in San Antonio, and then to connection with a publisher in New York who had expressed interest in a longer work. She spent 2 years writing it, in the evenings and on weekend mornings, in the kitchen, and once memorably in the meadow below the East Ridge because the light was good, and William was keeping Clara occupied nearby, and Theodore had brought her coffee and left her to it without comment, which she had loved him for enormously. The book was published in 1893. It was an account fictionalized enough to protect those who needed protecting, but honest in its bones, of a woman leaving a diminished life and building a new one. It was not a sensational story, and it was not a pretty story in the easy sense, but it was true in the way that things are true when they come from somewhere real, and it found readers who recognized themselves in it and were grateful for the recognition. Her name on the book was Esther Lockhart Stone. She had debated this. Lockhart was the name she had chosen for herself, the first act of self-determination in a long chain of them. Stone was the name she had earned alongside a man she trusted completely. She wanted both. She put both. Theodore had read the book when the first copy arrived from New York, sitting up half the night to finish it, and in the morning when Esther came downstairs he was at the kitchen table with the book in front of him and an expression on his face that was very quiet and very full. "You wrote this," he said. "I did. All of it was yours to carry," he said, "and you carried it alone for such a long time." "Not always alone," she said. "Not anymore." He stood up and held her for a long moment in the morning kitchen, and she let him, and it was the particular embrace of two people who know each other's weight and can hold it without effort. The book sold well enough that the publisher wanted another one. Esther had ideas. She always had ideas. She started the second one that winter, at the kitchen table in the evenings, in the life she had built. Lily married in 1895, which was a day that required all of Esther's equanimity to navigate. The man was James Harlow, a surveyor from Austin with good sense and genuine affection for Lily, and the additional excellent quality of being entirely unintimidated by her, which was essential because Lily Stone Harlow was now a young woman of 21 with her father's directness and her stepmother's analytical mind, and the combined effect of both of those things was something that required a particular kind of man to stand alongside without flinching. James Harlow did not flinch. He argued with her about the survey lines of their property with the same enthusiasm she brought to the argument, and Esther, watching this across the Thanksgiving table, had decided he was exactly right. Theodore walked Lily down the aisle of the same First Methodist church where he and Esther had married 11 years before, and Esther sat in the front pew with William, who was 9, and Clara on her lap, who was 5, and felt the double weight of joy and loss that comes when a child you have loved grows into their own life. It was the correct and natural order of things, and it was still a form of grief, and she allowed both of those things to be true simultaneously. After the ceremony in the churchyard, Lily had looked at Esther with those dark stone eyes and said, "I need to tell you something." "Tell me," Esther said. "You are the reason I believed it was possible," Lily said. "To start over, to become something. I watched you do it and I knew it was possible." Esther had held her, the child who had tied yellow ribbon to the end of a pew for a woman she barely knew and simply decided that the woman belonged there. The child who had changed everything by the force of her 8-year-old certainty about how things ought to be. "You started me," Esther said into her hair. "You know that." "I know," Lily said. "We started each other." They drove home from the wedding in the late afternoon. Theodore and Esther and William and Clara, along the road that Esther had walked into Caldwell Creek on 3 years before she had ever seen the Stone Ranch. The hill country was golden in the October light, the grass long and pale, the sky enormous and beginning to go rose and amber at the western edge. "Are you all right?" Theodore asked her in the quiet way he had. "I am," she said. She took his hand where it rested on the seat between them. "I was thinking about the road." "Which road?" "The one into town, the one I walked in on." She looked out at the passing landscape. "I was so frightened," she said. "I had done a very brave thing and I was terrified of it. I thought I was going somewhere to hide, not somewhere to live." He was quiet for a moment. William had fallen asleep against her side and Clara was watching the passing trees with the steady, companionable focus of a 5-year-old who has not yet developed the concept of boredom. "You were very brave," he said. "I was very desperate," she corrected. "There is a difference." "Sometimes there is not," he said. She thought about that. About the woman with $200 in her hem, about the false name, about the long ride south and west, about arriving in a town she had picked from a list because it had a school that needed a teacher, about a child with yellow ribbon who had looked at her and decided she belonged. "Theodore," she said. "I would do it all again," she said, "every bit of it if it led here." He lifted her hand and pressed it briefly to his mouth in the old-fashioned way, the way she had come to love because it was entirely his and entirely sincere. "So would I," he said. Clara looked up from her tree watching and said, "Are we almost home?" "Almost," Theodore said. "Good," Clara said, with Lily's word and Lily's tone, which made Esther laugh and Theodore smile. And the road unrolled in front of them through the golden October country toward the ranch lights beginning to show in the distance. And home was exactly what it was, not a word but a place and a people, and she had found it not by planning but by sitting down in the space that a child's faith had saved for her. 3 years later, in the spring of 1898, Esther's second book was published. She dedicated it to Theodore and to Lily and to William and to Clara, and then, in a line at the bottom of the dedication page that the publisher had raised an eyebrow at and she had kept anyway, she wrote, "And to yellow ribbon, which is the color of hope when it is tied by someone who has not yet been told it is impossible." The copy that sat on the shelf in the Stone Ranch parlor was the most worn copy in Texas, read and reread by every member of the household, and by the children Lily and James brought to visit, and by Edmund Voss, who came once a year for supper, and always asked if there was a third book coming. There was. There was always more to say about a woman who had survived a dark past and built something true on the other side of it, about the secrets that secrets cost you, and the people who hold the lamp while you find your way out. But those were words for another evening, another winter at the kitchen table, another quiet hour in the life she had built from nothing in a hill country town in 1883. For now, on this particular spring morning in 1898, Esther Lockhart Stone was standing at the window of the ranch kitchen with a cup of coffee, watching Theodore walk across the yard below with William, who was 12 now and nearly as tall as his father, and was learning the cattle operation with the same methodical attention he brought to everything, which he had gotten, people said, from his mother. Clara was at the kitchen table with a book and the focused serenity of a child who has already decided that the book is more interesting than the morning, which she had gotten from no one in particular and all of them at once. The Texas spring was coming in green and extravagant through the kitchen window, the wildflowers already starting along the creek bank, the sky the specific bright blue that you only got in the hill country in April. Theodore looked up from the yard and saw her at the window and raised his hand in the simple, private greeting that had been theirs for 14 years and would be for as long as they both lived. She raised her coffee cup back at him. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was not the kind of thing that made stories in the conventional sense, the way a yellow ribbon on a pew made a story, the way a woman standing frozen in a doorway made a story. But it was the thing all those stories had been moving toward. This morning, this window, this man in the yard, this child at the table, this life made wide and full from a life that had been made narrow and close. She had come to Caldwell Creek to hide, and had found instead the most exposed thing she had ever known, which was the life of someone who is fully seen and loved in the full seeing. She had been terrified and desperate, and she had sat down on a pew with a yellow ribbon because a child had decided she belonged there. And that act, that single act of sitting down in the space that love had saved for her, had changed the direction of everything. She finished her coffee and set the cup down and turned to Clara. "Are you going to tell me what you are reading, or am I going to have to guess?" Clara looked up. She had Esther's eyes, which everyone noticed and which Esther privately considered the finest thing she had ever made. "I am reading the one about the woman who leaves," she said. "Your book." Esther stood very still for a moment. "Where are you in it?" "The part where she sits down in the church," Clara said, "where the ribbon is." She looked at her mother with a child's forthright gaze. "Was that you, the woman in the book?" Esther crossed the kitchen and sat down at the table across from her daughter. She looked at the book in Clara's hands, at her own name on the cover, Esther Lockhart Stone. "Yes," she said, "that was me." Clara considered this with the gravity of a 7-year-old encountering something large. "Were you very frightened?" she asked. "Yes," Esther said, "but you sat down anyway." "Yes." "Because of the ribbon," Clara said. "Because of the ribbon," Esther confirmed. "And because of Lily, and eventually because of your father." Clara nodded slowly. "I think that is the bravest part," she said. "Not the leaving, the sitting down." Esther looked at her daughter, who was 7 years old and had just said the truest thing about her life that anyone had ever said. "Yes," she said softly. "I think you are right." She took Clara's hand and held it across the table, and outside in the spring yard Theodore and William moved among the cattle in the morning light, and the bluebonnets were coming up along the fence line, and the creek was running, and the Stone ranch was alive and green and full, and Esther Lockhart Stone was a woman who had sat down in a saved seat and built a world from the sitting. There was a Sunday the following week when she tied a piece of yellow ribbon to the end of the third pew back at First Methodist Church, before anyone else arrived, just her and the empty church in the early morning. She tied it the way Lily had always tied it, with a careful bow. She sat down in the pew and looked at the plain windows and the morning light coming through and the simple, honest space of a place where people came because they needed to. Theodore came in 5 minutes later and sat down beside her, not at the far end, but right beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. He looked at the ribbon and then at her and said nothing, which was exactly right. Lily came in with James and their 2 little ones, and William came in with Clara, and they filled the pew from one end to the other, all of them, the family that a yellow ribbon and a child's faith had started. And when the organ began, Esther Lockhart Stone sang with her whole voice in the house where her life had turned toward something good, and the ribbon was there at the end of the pew, not saving a seat anymore, because all the seats were full. It had always been that simple and that extraordinary. A woman alone on the road, a child with a ribbon, A man who built bookshelves in the evenings and said I love you before the question, because the question was separate from the love. And a seat that was always saved, even before anyone had agreed to come.